Okay, so I'm gonna cover some of the addenda that are available to us that's attached to the finance the 22A, the finance addendum. And it's interesting because this morning it came up in the legal symposium as well, because a lot of agents don't use them, even though when a buyer makes an offer and includes a finance contingency, those supplemental forms are included in that offer. And the buyer is actually asking the seller, Mr. Seller, you are welcome to verify that I have provided all the documentation to apply for a loan within 10 days after mutual acceptance. You can ask me to verify that, and I will verify that. And after 30 days after mutual acceptance, I'm also giving you permission to serve a right of rescission to me, because by then I should have all my financing ducks in a row, and I should be able to waive my finance contingency because I should be ready to close, right? So we got a 45-day close. We're only 2 weeks out from closing. You should have everything done, hopefully. Sometimes the one thing is the appraisal, and that's the reason why on the Form 22A, we make sure and check that we say that we will not waive the low appraisal form. So let me pull up the 22A first, and I guess it would be good if I shared my screen, huh? So let me pull up the 22A first. Now, this is the Northwest MLS forms. If you're not signed up for this, you need to get signed up for this, because, like I said, this has all the forms as well as the explainer manuals for the forms. So I'm not going to open up the manual, because we're just going to look at the 22A here really quickly. Boy, I wore a striped shirt again today. Look at that. That's just like, is that freaking anybody else's eyes out? Weird. I got to stop doing that. Maybe I need to bring one of those. I need to have like one of the, what do they call them? Those smocks that I can throw over, or maybe a sweater.
There you go.
Mr. Rogers sweater, solid color. So here's a great question. This also came up at the legal symposium today. And this relates to the 22EF, the evidence of funds, right? When you are using the evidence of funds, there's two sections in the 22EF. Either the buyer's disclosing that they have the non-contingent funds available in their account, and within 3 days they're going to provide the seller evidence of those funds after mutual acceptance. Does that make sense? So let's say buyer says, I've got $100,000 I'm going to put down on the loan, or cash. And they include the 22EF that says 3 days after mutual acceptance, I'm going to show you a bank balance statement, or I'm going to get a declaration from the lender that says that they verified that I've got those monies in the bank, right? Because in the finance contingency, the 22A, it says that seller is not relying upon any non-contingent funds, right? So let's go down. I got to move this over here because that's going to get in my way.
So I guess this is going to be kind of a question that goes along with what you got right there, is that if somebody does an offer and they say it's going to be a cash offer, are they required to do the EF, or can you counter asking for the EF?
That's a great question. You can counter. I do. I always counter asking for the EF. I want to see evidence of funds.
Right.
I I don't have to take your word for it. I don't, trust but
So,
verify, the old Reaganism.
so how would
Um,
you counter that? Would you just say that they would do an addendum saying that they need to provide the 22 EF for the offer to be accepted?
I would include it in there. I would send back the offer with a 22 EF signed by my buyer, having it checked. And on the addenda line on line 16, I would say see uh, addenda 22 EF,
Okay. All right. Perfect.
so that everybody knows that that was added to the contract, right?
Because that to me would be one part of the value proposition I would let people know for listings, that if we do get a cash offer, this is one of the things I'm going to do for you. I'm going
Correct.
to counter, you know what I mean?
The snag comes when in the bottom half of the 22 EF they say we are not relying upon any or that we are relying on non-contingent funds. And non-contingent funds is not the loan, because in the 22A you're already disclosing to the seller, listen, Mr. Seller, I need a loan. I'm relying upon getting this loan.
Right.
You're not going to use that 22 EF to disclose that you're relying on a loan, because that's what the 22A is for, right?
Correct.
Neither are you going to use it to disclose that you're relying upon the sale of a contingent property, because that's what the 22B and the 22Q are for, right? So
Correct.
you've already disclosed that. You do not want to put those on the 22EF, because if you do that, buyer is in jeopardy of losing the earnest money.
Correct.
The 22EF does not protect the buyer's money, the earnest money. All it is a declaration from the buyer to the seller that says either I've got the funds in the bank, or I'm relying upon, it could be a gift from grandma or mom and dad, gift funds. It could be I'm relying upon the sale of a car. It could be I'm relying upon getting money out of my retirement fund. And 10 days before closing, I'm going to show evidence that I've turned that those contingent funds, whatever they are, a gift or a sale of a stock or sale of a car, whatever, right? That 10 days before closing, I'm going to have that money in the bank.
Okay.
If that doesn't happen, EF says that the buyer forfeits, is breach of the contract and forfeits their earnest money.
Got it. Okay.
So it's a pretty serious form, so the same way, if the seller says I'm not relying on any contingent funds, I've got the money in the bank, and then they use the 22EF and says, oh yeah, I've got the money in the bank, and then 3 days later aren't able to prove that, they're in breach of the contract and could lose their earnest money.
Right.
So that 22EF sometimes gets really confused when it's attempted to be used in conjunction with the 22A.
It sounds like the 22 EF is mainly in benefit of the seller.
Yes, exactly right.
Unless the buyer has like the money definitely and there's no issues whatsoever, and they say, hey, we want this house right now, and we've got everything and we want to show that we're serious and beat other offers.
Correct.
Okay.
The other part of that though is if buyer only provides a 22A but is relying upon contingent funds, they're automatically in breach of the contract.
Right.
And could lose their earnest money.
Correct. Got it.
So it behooves the buyer to make sure it would be best if the buyer took care of that before they ever made an offer. Have the cash in the bank.
Correct.
But sometimes, especially in a hot market like now, they're relying upon, maybe getting, a lot of times, a lot of it I've used is usually retirement funds that are in an IRA account, or, funds that are in a mutual fund account, and they're not ready cash available today, but it's going to take a week or two to get it out of my mutual fund, or it's going to take a week or two to get it out of my retirement fund, right?
Right.
So I want to make my offer today, but I need you to know that I need a couple weeks to get the cash out of whatever fund it is, and have it available. And I'll provide proof of that once those funds are in my bank account. It could be, like I said, a $20,000 gift from mom and dad, or, from grandpa and grandma. And I don't have it in my bank, but they've got it. And I will show you that I've got it in my bank once they've transferred the money to me. Does that make sense?
So it's basically just promising that you will be receiving that money, right?
Exactly right,
In a way.
Exactly right. I am promising to the extent, Victor, promising to the extent that I am willing to put the earnest money on the table if I don't deliver on my promise. So
Okay.
$1,500 or $2,500 or $3,000 earnest money, I'm saying to the seller, if I don't deliver on this promise, you get to keep my earnest money. So that's a great way of putting it, Victor. Yeah. Does that make sense? So so with the finance contingency, the buyer is delivering this to the seller, right? Buyer saying, Mr. Seller, I'm relying upon getting a loan. And right up here in line 12 and 13 and 14, it says, for the purpose of this addendum, application means the submission of the buyer's financial information for the purposes of obtaining an extension of a credit, including the buyer's name, income, social security, the property address, purchase price, and loan amount, right? So that's what application means, is I've made application. So down here in the loan information then, buyer saying to the seller, Mr. Seller, you can check up on me to make sure that I've, again, delivered on my promise that I said I would make application for loan. So right here in section 2, paragraph A, seller's request for loan information. Buyer is telling the seller, you can request loan information to make sure I'm delivering on my promise. So at any time, 10 days if not mutual. I've seen this shortened up. 10 days after mutual acceptance, seller may give once a notice requesting information related to the status of the buyer's loan application. And that's the form 22AL. And there's nothing to the 22AL. It says, please deliver a confirmation that you have made application for a loan. So let me pull that up here real quick, because there is not a whole lot to it. Okay, that's it.
So Ron, when you do the offer, if you send the letter from the lender, so that they're qualified, does that count as that application, or are we talking about filling out the rest of the application, not a pre-approval?
Filling out the rest of the application, Jeremy. Exactly right. Yes. So usually a pre-qualification, well, not a pre-qualification, usually a pre-approval letter just simply means that they've given their initial financial information to a lender and they've looked at their numbers and said, yeah, we can do a loan for you. But they haven't actually delivered their income statements or, bank statements or social security numbers or had a credit check. Some lenders will do a credit check initially. They do a soft credit check so they don't get hit on it. But for most of the part, they wait until all that paperwork's in and then they do a hard credit check. But this is the form. It's just a request for information. Pursuant to Section 2 of the Finance Addendum, seller requests that buyer gives notice of the status of buyer's loan application, and buyer's going to use the form 22AP. So that's this loan information notice here, and this has got the check boxes, right? So the buyer is going to send this back to the seller, right? And so buyer's made loan application, which included buyer's name, income, social security number. That's right out of the 22A. Remember, we just read that, right? Okay, 2, and we list the mortgage company here. Buyer authorizes the listing firm and the listing broker and the seller to contact the lender to inquire about the status of buyer's loan approval anytime before closing. This gives you, as the listing broker and even the seller themselves, permission to contact the lender and verify that they've actually delivered on all of these documents and to find out the status of their loan and how confident that they are going to be able to close on time. Does that make sense? How important is that phone call?
Depends on who you are. No, it'd be extremely, extremely important, especially if you're the.
Extremely important. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to agents. We're 2 weeks from closing, and they found out that the buyer hasn't even made application for loan. They didn't even make an application for loan, and we're 2 weeks to closing. No documentation. Then they call the lender. They get LA. What about? And the lender says, "Well, I haven't talked to them in over a month." I can't tell you how many times that's happened.
So now with this here, would you, if you're the buyer's agent, so let's say you're the selling agent and you do the offer and everything like that, if this is a requested item,
Right.
and you fill this out, would you then forward a copy to the lender so that they know they have permission to talk to them, or would you let the listing agent now with that in hand, or the seller provide that to the lender at the time they contact them?
So some buyers agents and will tell their buyers, send this over to your lender to have them fill it out. Most lenders, not all, some lenders will go ahead and check the boxes that they have. But there's no place on here for the lender to sign. There's no place for the lender to sign.
Why not?
The lender is not party to the contract.
Right, and that's just the buyer saying, yes, the buyer is done.
Party to contract, right?
Huh.
So this is where the buyer says, okay, yeah, I've done the recent pay stubs, I've done the W-2s, the 1040, on the last 2 years of tax returns, check all these boxes. And then I'm going to sign it, verifying buyer has provided lender with the above information and any additional information lender is required buyer to provide to lender before the date of this notice. They're going to sign it. And then I'm going to send it back to the listing agent, right? This again goes back to the old Reaganism, trust but verify. As soon as you get this back, now you have authorization to contact their lender. Hey, Mr. Lender or Miss Lender, yeah, I'm the listing agent for XYZ property that so-and-so is going to, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so is going to buy. And I understand that you're their lending officer and they delivered a notice to me that I'm permitted to contact you. And I just want to verify where we are in their loan process. They've told me that they've provided these forms. Is that true? Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that they followed up on that. So what does your lending process look like? Do you think we're going to close on time? How confident are you that we're going to close on time? Okay. Is there anything else that you need from them that you're waiting for before you can make full application and get the paperwork over to title company before closing? Is there anything missing? Do you see any hiccups? Oh, well, that's great. Was it okay if I call you a couple of weeks before closing just to check in and make sure everything's okay? Great. I'll talk to you then. Now, unless the conversation goes sideways and you find out from the lender, well, they're missing a bunch of stuff and we're waiting on verification from employment from an employer, yada, 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 I probably will call every week, right? I want to make sure that paperwork is being turned in.
So in one of the deals that I just did, one of the lenders actually had an update, like a weekly update coming out about documents and stuff like that, everything that's happening with the loan. And they had the listing agent listed on those updates. So the email would go out to everybody, including the listing agent.
That's great. I wish that every lender did that.
Yeah, I like working with that lender specifically for that reason. He was extremely
One
good
of the,
about
one
getting
of the
that
problems
information.
you will discover is that a lot of lenders, there's just a lack of communication. They don't communicate. And it's not until you pick up, in fact, we got one today where Katie and I, we wrote an offer last night and took forever to get a pre-approval letter. And then we had some other questions and he doesn't even answer his phone, you know? So it can be very frustrating. So yeah, who your lender is can make a whole lot of difference. And whether your lender is local or it's, you know, Eastern Standard Time or Central Standard Time makes a whole lot of difference too, right? I was just dealing with the lenders down in Arizona, and that was frustrating. So the buyer's going to fill out this form, right? They're going to verify. That's going to give you as the listing agent and the seller permission to contact their lender to follow up and make sure that they are on track with everything, right? And then 30 days, 10 days before closing or 15 days before closing, the 30 days after mutual acceptance, I'm going to deliver this notice here. So that comes later on down in the 22A. So here we've done this. We've delivered the 22AL within 3 days of receiving the seller's request for loan information, right? The AL. Buyer's going to give a notice of the buyer's loan application, right? That's the 22AP we just looked at with the checkoff list, right? Right? It's going to include the date of application, the name of the lender, a list of the information the buyer provided the lender, and a warranty that the buyer has provided all information requested by the lender, right? If the buyer fails to timely give to seller a completed loan information notice, timely, 3 days, seller may give the right to terminate notice described in paragraph 3 at any time after the date the loan information is due. So 3 days, buyer has 3 days to respond. And if they don't respond on that third day, you need to deliver the notice of termination to protect your seller. You have to. If you do not deliver that notice, seller's stuck with the buyer they got. Notice it's the right to terminate. It doesn't say the seller shall terminate. It's the right to terminate. So it puts the seller in the driver's seat and say, hey, listen, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I need verification that you're ready to go. And if you're not, I'm terminating this contract and we're going to put the house back on the market because I don't want to wait 30 days out before I find out that you haven't done your due diligence in getting your loan application done. Does that make sense? So as a listing agent, this is the one opportunity that the buyer is giving you to put you and your seller in the driver's seat to make sure things are moving along so you're not surprised later on to find out that they haven't been doing what they were supposed to be doing to get their loan approved. And again, I can't tell you how many times that happens in our office. It happens a lot. And then I ask the agent, well, did you use the 22AL? Did you request the 22AP and make sure that they made application? Did you follow up with calling the lender to make sure that they had truly given all that information? And a lot of times their argument of, well, that's the buyer's duty. That's the buyer's lender. You know, why isn't the buyer? Well, you know what? Not every agent provides a high level of service to your client. Your job is to provide a high level of service to your client. And part of that is using these forms and then following up. That's why you're getting paid. Does that make sense? Okay. So if it's not 3 days after, if you haven't got a notice after 3 days, you have to deliver the right to terminate. If they delivered that and you verified that they're good to go and everything is good and you get a glowing report from the lender, that's where I would tell the lender, well, I'll call you on day 30 of mutual acceptance just to make sure we're good to go a couple of weeks before closing. And otherwise, I will be calling every week. Or hopefully you got a lender like Jeremy's has, and they do a regular update, a regular weekly update. So this seller's right to terminate is really big. At any time, 30 days If it's not filled in, it could be sooner. I've seen agents put 20 days. After mutual acceptance, seller may give notice that seller may terminate the agreement at any time 3 days after delivery of that notice. So they're going to deliver that right to terminate, and they have 3 days to decide whether they're going to continue to move forward with this contract or go shop for another buyer. If buyer has not previously waived the financing contingency, seller may give notice of the termination of this agreement anytime following the 3 days after the delivery of the right to terminate. The seller gives the termination notice before the buyer has waived the financing contingency. This agreement is terminated and the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. We're going to use the 22AR. That's what we just pulled up here. All right. Seller's right to terminate. Seller hereby gives notice that the buyer does not waive the finance contingency. Seller may terminate this agreement anytime 3 days after delivery of this notice. This is also where you give notice of termination. Seller hereby gives notice that seller elects to terminate this agreement. Seller instructs the party holding the earnest money to disperse the earnest money to the buyer. The response is on this form. So if they send over and check this first box, buyer is going to respond, hopefully, with this. Buyer's notice waiver of finance contingency. Buyer waives the finance contingency set forth in the finance addendum. In other words, they're saying, I've satisfied my finance addendum and I'm not going to use that contingency to get out of this contract. Again, they're putting the earnest money on the line there, right? So back to the 22A then. So that's why this paragraph C is so important. And Victor, you need to really pay attention to this paragraph because this catches a lot of newer agents, because this is one place in our contract that it throws the buyer under the bus, and I don't understand why. Because most of our contracts protect the buyer. This is one place where the buyer's thrown under the bus. So it says right here, buyer's waiver of the finance contingency. So we just sent the right to terminate. Mr. Buyer, if you're not ready to terminate your finance contingency, I'm going to terminate this agreement within 3 days. Buyer response says, no, we're all good to go. I'm good to close. We're good. Lender says, yeah, we're good to go. We're going to close. And so they respond with that second box here in the 22AR and says, we're going to waive this finance contingency. But let's say we're good to go, but we're still waiting for the appraisal to come in. What happens then? Well, that's where this paragraph is really, really important when you're representing the buyer. Buyer's waiver of the finance contingency under this paragraph will or will not constitute a waiver of paragraph 7. And paragraph 7 is the low appraisal. And I tell agents to have this one marked automatically all the time in your contracts, in your templates. Will not. That protects your buyer. Let's say that, and it's happening a lot, appraisal's taking a long time to get back, right? And if I waive the finance contingency and I waive the low appraisal and then the appraisal comes in low, there's no protection for the buyer. But by checking the will not box, I protect my buyer and saying, listen, we're willing to waive the finance contingency unless there's a low appraisal. And if there's a low appraisal, then we're going to negotiate. Does that make sense, Victor? Yeah, so we want to protect the buyer in a low appraisal situation, even if they waive the finance contingency. Hey, listen, we've got all our documentation in, we're all good to go. We just haven't got the appraisal report back. So we're waiting for the appraisal report. We're willing to waive this as long as the appraisal doesn't come back in low. Okay?
And it doesn't have to come in low by much.
It doesn't have to come in low by much. So a lot of agents who are unawares, they will leave these two boxes not checked. They don't check either one. But notice what the boilerplate language is here. The boilerplate language is will if not filled in. So if you don't intentionally check will not, the default language is that it will constitute a waiver of low appraisal. And to me, that's crazy. I mean, of all the places in the contract, why I would think that the default language would be will not. If neither box is checked, it should be will not constitute a waiver of the low appraisal. But so that could end up being and it's come back several times to bite agents because they weren't paying attention, they didn't check the box. I say when you set up your templates and zip forms, just go ahead and have that automatically set up so that box will always be checked and you'll never miss it. Okay? Any questions around any of this so far?
So you said the 22R AR, you use that form for both seller and buyer.
Correct.
So is it the same form, or you have to send a separate one back?
That's a good question. No, you would use the same form. So the seller would check it up here and sign it, and then the buyer would use the same form, check this box and sign it.
Okay.
Yeah, they would use the same form. Yeah. Okay. Any questions around any of that?
If you're, let's say you're a buyer's agent, and you get the notice that what was the one, I think it was AP, the one asking for the proof of funds, or to be able to contact the lender. I mean.
Yes,
So
that's 22 AP, right.
So you get the 22 AP, but let's say it's 11 days after because the seller's agent didn't get it out on time.
Right.
How would the conversation go at that point? Because really, technically, it wouldn't have come on time.
It wouldn't have come on time. And that's a conversation you should have with your seller, right? If the buyer didn't deliver it on time, then the conversation with the seller could go along the lines of, listen, this wasn't delivered in a timely manner. Time is of the essence when it comes to contracts, right?
Right.
Time is of the essence. So, Mr. Seller, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, what would you like to do? You have the right to deliver right of termination, or would you like to continue to proceed to closing? Most sellers are going to say, nah, you know what? We're good. Let's go ahead and get it done. But that is a conversation you should have with them. You need to let them know they're right. Because particularly in this market, let's say they've got a backup offer that's $10,000 or $15,000 more than this one, and they would like to be able to get out of this contract, right?
Mm-hmm. So because we're at the first part of it is the listing agent sending the form saying we want contact with the financing from the buyer.
Correct.
And they have 10 days to do that. So the calculation of time starts and it goes calendar days, right? Or is that counting weekends
well, 10 days would, yeah. So 5 days or less is only calendar days. 5 days or more, we count. Let me start over. 5 days or less is only business days. We don't include weekends or holidays. 5 days or more, we include calendar days.
So the listing agent and for the seller, and they have the 10 days, it's calendar days, including weekends. And they have that time to say
the inspection period. So there's going to be two things that are going to happen.
Okay.
You've got 10 days to do the home inspection, and you've got 10 days to deliver this notice. And then the buyer has 3 days to respond to the inspection notice and 3 days to respond to the request for lender information.
And that would not include the weekends, correct? That would be then the 3 days would then
the
be.
3 days would not, no. So if you delivered it today, day 1 would be tomorrow, Thursday. Day 2 would be Friday. Day 3 would be
Monday.
Monday.
Correct. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Victor. That whole computation of time and counting days can get really weird. So you just kind of have to, wrap your mind around that. But if it's 5 days or less, We're not going to count weekends or holidays.
Makes sense.
So, having said that, sometimes there's just kind of a bit of a strategy of when you're going to deliver that notice, right? I might wait till day 10 to deliver the notice because I know it's going to give me, holiday, or maybe I'll cut out the weekend if I deliver it on Tuesday because Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I'll get notice back by Friday. I'm not going to have to wait over the weekend to figure out what they're going to do. So there's a little bit of a strategy that goes in there. Sometimes, not all the time. Sometimes it doesn't really matter, but sometimes it can. Sometimes that can come to play into the timeline of things. So, okay. There was one other. I forget what it is now. Seemed like there was one other form I wanted to cover in that. Oh, the low appraisal form. So we talked about the buyer making sure that will not box is checked that says that they will not waive the low appraisal. Remember that? Buyer waives the financing contingency in the financing addendum. And down here at the bottom, we said we want to make sure and check. Oh, it's on the top page here. We want to make sure that this is waived. So let's say you said, okay, we're not going to waive. We're waiting for the appraisal to come back, and then the appraisal comes in low, right? That's where you want to make sure, and you have the you'll use the 22AN, the notice of low appraisal. And so there's several remedies to a low appraisal. It doesn't automatically kill the deal, but buyer and seller are going to have to come to terms with what they're going to do about the low appraisal, right? So this is the form that the buyer is going to send over, because buyer just was notified from their lender, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we just got notice, we just got the appraisal back from the appraiser, and it's $10,000 less than your agreed upon purchase price. This is where you are going to deliver on this form. Buyer gives notice that buyer's lender's appraised value of the property is less than the purchase price. So let's say we agreed on $310,000. Appraiser comes back and says, I can only find value for $300,000. Buyer's not obligated to pay $310,000 for the house because they're depending upon financing, right? And financing saying we're not financing more than $300,000 on your house. We don't see the value there. So what does buyer do and what does seller do? Well, buyer's going to deliver this notice, and then that gives seller an opportunity to respond. Notice of reappraisal or reconsideration of value. The seller gives notice that a reappraisal or reconsideration of value has been completed in an amount not less than the purchase price, and buyer shall promptly seek lender's approval of the reappraisal or reconsideration. That's one option that the seller can take. They can pursue getting a reappraisal or reconsideration of value. I haven't found that to work very well very often. The reason for that is appraisers seem to be extremely protective of their appraisals, and they don't like the idea that they could be wrong. That's just my experience, but it's very difficult to get them to reconsider the appraised value. Sometimes if the appraisal is wildly wrong, I've seen them correct it. I had that happen on a new construction. The appraisal that came in wasn't even close, and the guy had used homes that wasn't even close to where we were building the house. And I found homes that were much closer and much more similar that we were able to use to get a reconsideration of value. So that can be used. That typically is not used a lot. Usually it's the next three. So the next one is.
I have a question in regards to that.
Yeah.
Hey, Ron.
Yes.
Yeah. So in regards to reappraisal, do you have to
Yeah.
use the same person for that, or can it be a different one to do
No,
the appraisal?
that could happen two ways. It could be a different appraiser, or it could be that other comparable homes are submitted for that same appraiser to consider in his value of the property. So it can happen either way.
Okay.
Is it the lender who provides the appraiser?
What's that?
Is not the lender who selects the appraiser?
Um, no, not necessarily. Most lenders have a blind appraisal. They've got an AMC. There's a pool of appraisals, and they put out a request for an appraisal to be done. They don't get to select. There's a few lenders in town that can be more selective of who's in their pool, but because of the whole 2007, 2008 housing collapse debacle and and Wells Fargo was a big violator of this, with the lender working with the appraiser, and the appraisers were working for the lenders, and it just, that whole thing went wrong. So most of the lenders, it's a blind appraisal. They can't choose their appraiser.
So one of the deals that just closed last week, the listing agent, when the appraiser contacted them to make the arrangements to go do the appraisal,
Right?
sent an email with several of the pending and closed deals that were kind of in the locality, and the type, almost like a CMA kind of, almost, if you want to put it that way, but sent that to the appraiser before they even went out and did it.
Right.
Just kind of, and I thought that was kind of preemptive and pretty smart. And we came in with no problems, but.
Yeah, so it's very smart. I typically will leave a hard copy of the CMA I did for the property at the house when the appraiser gets there, because then he can look through it and he can see the properties that I chose. And a lot of times they like that because I've done the work for them. And they'll go back, they'll double check my work. They're not going to take my word for it, but they'll look and see. And particularly if you've been around a long time and they know you and trust you, yeah, you can. That's a great way of doing it. And I highly suggest doing that. Right. So. And even sometimes if you've got comparable properties you've eliminated, you said, I didn't use this property because of X, Y, Z, that is good information for them to use too. Okay. So of the three other choices, these are typically the ones that come up most often. The first one is the seller consents to reduce the price to the appraised value. That's just the easy one, right? That's where the seller says, okay, whatever. We'll reduce our price to what the appraiser says it's worth. Okay. Or the seller proposes to reduce the purchase price to an amount, a lot of times there is a negotiating between the buyer and the seller that the buyer will come with extra cash to the table too, right? The third one is where the seller just outright rejects the low appraisal, says I'm not moving forward. That's the third one. Rejection of low appraisal. Seller gives notice that the seller rejects the buyer's notice of low appraisal, is not going to consider reappraisal or reconsideration, does not consent to reduction of the purchase price, and does not propose to reduce the purchase price. I haven't seen that happen too many times, but I have seen it happen a few times. Most of the time where I've seen that third option take place is where the seller needed so much proceeds out of their house to be able to do what they wanted to do next. Let's say they needed $100,000 out of the house and the appraisal came back and they were only going to get $80,000 out of the house, and that wasn't going to enable them to purchase the property that they wanted to get, or the next home they wanted. Most often it's it's the second or third option that's chosen. Okay. Any questions about that? Pretty straightforward. And again, Victor, both parties are going to respond on the same form. So on this form, buyer's going to give notice, and then on the same form, seller's going to respond with one of these and sign it down here. Now, just because the seller responds doesn't obligate the buyer automatically. So buyer gives notice that the buyer elects to terminate this agreement and the earnest money shall be refunded. Notice of waiver, the buyer waives the finance contingency in the finance addendum. Sometimes that happens because they've got cash. Buyer accepts seller's proposal to reduce the purchase price to an amount more than the appraised value of the property pursuant to paragraph 7B3 in the financing, and buyer represents the buyer has sufficient funds to close the sale under these terms. That's where seller says, I'm going to reduce my price, but I'm not going to reduce it that much. And buyer says, well, I still really want the house, so I'll come up with the extra cash. That's typically when that happens. And I see that happen a lot. Especially some of your nicer homes and the buyer really wants to be in that neighborhood and really wants that house. I've seen buyers many times come up with extra cash. And then this other option, I haven't seen this a lot. Seller consented to reduce the purchase price to an amount not more than the appraised value of the property pursuant to 7B2 in the financing addendum. Buyers obtaining an FHA, VA, or USD financing and gives the notice that buyer will close at the reduced price. And that's just where seller says, okay, I'm going to completely reduce my price to the appraised value. Okay. Any questions? Okay, those are the forms I wanted to cover today. I hope you will incorporate them and really use them. They really need to be used, particularly if you're the listing agent and representing your seller. But you need to be aware of them on the buyer side too. So if you don't have any other questions, I'm going to let you go. Bill, you got any questions?
No, thank you, Ron. It was nice and everything was clear.
Good. Yeah, these forms, for one reason or another, these forms seem to catch a lot of agents off guard, and I don't know why they're not implemented or used. Typically, they just deliver the 22A and then nothing happens after that. But I can just tell you from personal experience working in our brokerage that a lot more agents would have a smoother road to closing if they use those forms, and they would prevent a lot of heartache on the part of their sellers, because there's just a lot of frustration if you've been out 3-4 weeks, your home's been off the market, and then you discover that the buyer hasn't even made application for loan, or the buyer doesn't qualify for loan, or whatever's going on. You need, as the listing agent, you need to know what's going on the other side of that equation, so that your seller can make the informed decisions that they need to make. Okay?
All right.
All right. Appreciate you guys. Thanks for being here with me. And we'll look forward to catching you next week.
All right. Thank you,
All
Ron.
right, thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Have a good day.
Bye, guys.
Good night.
You too.